Right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second event hosted by Equality Bahamas during the Global 16 Days campaign in 2024. We are really excited to be having this conversation with Patrice Daniel, who's a psychotherapist and activist based in and from Barbados, Erin Greene, who is a long time human rights advocate in the Bahamas and now a radio show host, and Jessica Russell, who is a therapist based in Grand Bahama and a member of the board at Equality Bahamas. This is, again, the second event. If you want to check out all of the events that we have lined up, you can go to tiny.cc/16days24, see the full lineup, register, and you'll be able to tell which events are in person and which ones are virtual. Lots of virtual events. So our friends all over the region and all over the world, feel free to join us. Today we are talking about rage. We decided on the theme of rage and anti-resilience for the campaign this year. And as I said at the event last night, I don't know that we really knew exactly why we wanted to focus on these two areas, but we really kind of locked into them, particularly since we started with a conversation with Soraya Shamali, who wrote two books, and one is about rage, Rage Becomes Her, and one is about resilience, the resilience myth. And the two just kind of came together. Now, more recently, as folks in the Bahamas know, we had two horrific crimes, horrific acts of gender-based violence that include rape and ended with femicide. We read the stories of 12-year-old Adrielle Moxie, who, by all accounts, was very spirited, very active, did lots of after-school activities, spent a lot of time at church, and was generally expected to come home around 6 sometimes, and maybe around 9 or 10 if she was involved in church activities. And she did not come home. And her body was later found in bushes near her home. And it has since become clear that she was raped and she did die by strangulation. Just hours later, we heard the story of 72-year-old Ferencia Butler, who had spent some time with family celebrating a birthday and was back home. And her son and grandson came home to find that the house had been broken into. The deadbolt was on, so the person who broke in locked the door and they had to pick the lock to get in. And she was raped. And she is now dead. We don't know the cause, the exact cause of death. These are two cases of just so disgusting, so horrific, so terrible and terrifying. Gender-based violence, and we see it resulting in femicide. And it's particularly frustrating to see that we are experiencing all of these deaths of women and girls. We are going through all of this grief. We have all of this very temporary outrage. It always dissipates. And the conversation about femicide doesn't seem to be moving much further. And we have a government that has been refusing to acknowledge femicide. And for those who don't know, Equality Bahamas participated in the Universal Periodic Review process in 2023 and really pushed for UN member states to make recommendations to the Bahamas that we name the gender-based and sex-based killing of women and girls femicide, count those cases as femicide, report on them as femicide, and then analyze those cases so that we're able to identify risk factors and indicators and work toward prevention and also intervention. We were successful in getting one member state to make such a recommendation, which the Bahamas supported, which is similar to saying that they accept it and they will work on it. But they also made a note that, quote, there are no high incidences of femicide or there are no reported incidences of femicide in the Bahamas, end quote. So it raises a lot of questions. I'm sure you know the questions. I'm not even going to get into them, but it starts with, do you even know what femicide is? Lots of reasons to be angry, and anger can be uncomfortable and it can be unfamiliar because we've been taught for so long as women, as girls, that it's inappropriate and that's like a hard emotion. We need to stick to the soft emotion and lean towards sadness. But right now, do we need anger? Do we need rage? And why? And if we do, how do we make it so that we are more comfortable with it or comfortable with the discomfort of rage? And then how do we turn that into activism? And so we've invited Patrice, Erin, and Jessica to have this conversation with us because we've seen all of you deal with that rage and put it into your work. And I plan to not say very much beyond this and just kind of create a space for all of you to share your insights with us. And just to get us started, guess each of you tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship, your personal relationship with rage. And let's go Patrice, Erin, and then Jessica.
Hi, good night, everyone. My name, as Alicia would have mentioned, is Patrice Daniel, pronouns she, her, and I'm from Barbados and based in Barbados. I'm a psychotherapist by training, so I did focus my studies on clinical mental health counseling in the US. However, I was very fortunate in that all of my studies were placed within a context where my professors believed that there's no such thing as a mentally well person in a fundamentally unjust society. So a lot of my studies looked at the impact of systems and structures of oppression on the individual person, exploring the impacts of misogyny, racism, white supremacy, socioeconomic inequalities, etc., because you can't self-care or journal yourself out of oppression. So there was always that context surrounding my studies in mental health. And right now my work focuses on anything to do with gender, feminism, anti-racism, dismantling, unpacking white supremacy. And those are places where one can get very angry. My relationship to rage, I would say I have a pretty good relationship to rage, and it made me think in preparation for this conversation this evening about where that relationship came from, where I feel like I can express it and I feel like I can deploy it. And I think it's because of my family, where if I come home after some presentation, some conference, and I am lit, like so angry, I have a place to express it. I can rail and rage, and my mother will say, yes, that is very annoying. They shouldn't have done that, etc. There will be no encouragement that I should calm down or I should just settle. I'm thinking back to a specific instance, but I can go into that more later after the others have introduced themselves. But thinking back about how I came home after that conference, and I went on and on and on loudly for a very long time, and it was just space for me to do that. So in general, I would say that I have a positive relationship with it. It's not something that I feel terribly scared about, or I see it as an emotion to shy away from. So I'll stop here for now.
Sorry, thank you. I was just taking that all in. Thank you very much. I'm Erin Greene, intersectional human rights advocate for a little while. I think 20 years is a long time now, but I still think 20 years is 19, like 89, so forgive me. I don't know, my relationship with rage at this point is very interesting. I'm very angry, and like I'm okay with that now, right? I'm very cool with that now. However, as a radio host, a public advocate, a radio host, and a media personality, I perform with an improv troupe, with a couple improv troupes. When I leave here, I go into a practice for Thursday night, and like holding those three spaces as well, I have to balance rage, right? Like, but not balance it, but like the expression of it. I have to manage it, and that is what I work on, right? Like I'm comfortable being angry. Like I angry right now. But I angry because I have to go on the road. And every time I get on the road, I angry. And I'm okay. I'm not okay with the circumstances that cause it, but I'm okay being angry about it. And I'm okay expressing it, right? Because I think it is an appropriate response to what is happening. And I can talk a little bit about that as well later. But on the radio now, I have to bite my tongue, eat my words, gobble them up and swallow a little vomit and find another way to say it. And then there's the comedy, right? The improv and political satire on the show and outside of the show that then requires that type of moderation, but also is like a channel and an avenue to do something with it. Yeah. And so I'm okay being angry. I just okay that sometimes I can't just rage.
Okay, my name is Jessica Russell. I'm a therapist and a human rights advocate. I identified with things that both Patrice and Erin said. The first is that I find myself often saying you can't self-care and or manifest your way out of these feelings. And my relationship with rage is very similar to Erin, in that I'm not okay with the reason that I feel it, but I'm okay that I feel it, because if something doesn't enrage you, you're not really paying attention. But it's the expression. And Erin, I think you should teach a class. When I hear your show, you could teach a class on how to express yourself calmly in the face of rage. Oh yeah, the last thing that I wanted to say is I went back to basics with this for this panel and Googled the definition of rage. And of course, the first thing that comes up is violent, uncontrolled anger. But within the definition is also an intense desire or passion. So if you take those two versions of the word, somebody else's rage, uncontrollable anger, turned into my passion, and that's why I'm here today. And that's another story I could tell later.
Okay, so since Jessica broke out the dictionary, let's talk a little bit about what rage is and what it feels like to experience rage. I'm going to start with Patrice.
So I also went back to basics and Googled, looked it up, because we hear these words all the time. We hear all the synonyms, but each of them has a slightly different connotation. So the part about rage I liked was the explosive nature in the definition. So it talks about it being an explosive anger. It talked about the uncontrolled element. It talked about the fury. And it also, one of the definitions talked about rage as in a raging hurricane, something that is active and moving. So those elements of rage, I think the fact that it's uncontrollable is a good thing. So the uncontrollable active movement. So it felt like not just anger, but anger that had a movement to it. And the idea that if you could deploy that anger, deploy that movement, that uncontrolled element, that fury and intensity, then it could result in change. When I feel rage, it feels very physical. Yep, somebody in the chat is saying rage against a machine. Exactly. So the idea that rage is raging against something, raging against a system. It is not just anger in a nebula sense, but directed. And when I feel rage, I feel it physically, very much so. I can feel the tension in the pit of my stomach. My heart is beating fast. I might start to feel hot in my face and start to sweat. And it then makes me think about what would relieve that feeling, but relieve it in a way that I am glad to have relieved it in that way afterwards. So then that is the question. Do I want, because the feeling will be relieved, but do I want to relieve it by shouting? And in some cases, yeah, that is absolutely the appropriate response. Or do I want to relieve it in another type of intervention? I always feel like if when I watch back the video of myself and, you know, main character on a sitcom, I want to have handled it in a way that, yeah, I'm like, yes, I like how I handled that situation.
Yeah, you both have me thinking about that uncontrolled element and how that's probably feeding into the fear that people have of rage. And then Patrice, you got into sort of the embodiment of it, that heat is
Mhm.
also scary. It's uncomfortable, and you kind of start to feel physically out of control, right? Erin, do you have a similar experience of rage?
I get very angry, right? And in most instances, because I know what the answer is, right? But I'm also very aware of all of the barriers and limitations, the things that lie between this moment and the right response, right? So for me, it's a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of energy from me, right? And so it's important for me to then do something with it. Usually political satire, right? But it is all of those things. It is a movement, and it moves me to do something, right? Most importantly, it moves me to do something. And so a lot of the energy is that movement stirring up. And then a lot of the energy that I'm burning is moderating myself, right? Moderating myself, empathy, spatial awareness, critical thinking. The most important one, you don't think you're going to like jail. I don't think I'm going to like it, right? But all of these things, and then taking myself to understanding why people are doing what they're doing so that I could temper that energy, right? So like the hard work is in the moderating it, but you know, all of the definitions, the movement, and it compels me to do something. I have to do something. And so, you know, in this sense of respectability politics, a lot of the energy is convincing myself that I'm still a badass, even though I didn't pick your car up and throw it in the bush. You know?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's connected to the way that you see yourself too,
Mhm.
right? And the way that
Mhm.
you imagine that other people are perceiving you in the
Mhm.
moment. Because I think I have that experience if I am feeling rage and I'm trying to kind of moderate myself, I'm also kind of thinking, but I don't want you to think. I don't want this person to think for a second.
Right.
So
And
there's
then
that. But
so
you also talked, Erin, about this being in that moment of rage, but also already thinking about the next thing. Like, what are you
mhm.
gonna do with it? So I wonder if you're able to sit in the rage, or are you kind of pushing yourself to that middle space where you're trying to figure out how do I get to the next thing?
Well, usually I'm behind the wheel of a car, but like, you know, and so the steering wheel. And so it is pushing, you know, it's pushing myself away from that sort of as quickly as possible. And it's getting close, you know, it's getting closer to that. But because of like this place, there's an extenuating circumstance. You know, like I want to say to Patrice, I was in Barbados driving with a friend, peak traffic in Barbados, and we hit a roundabout and we stopped. We didn't enter the roundabout. And my friend then explained to me, because she's Jamaican, hey, we stop here because in Barbados, they don't block up the roundabout. Even if the traffic's bad, they ain't gonna block up, right? And so I watched this guy looking at us because he was so upset. And I know that look, right? He's in traffic. It ain't me. He just upset. And he's looking at us. because he needs us to see that he is going to go, right? And he had to make that contact. He's so angry. And I say to myself, look at this boy still doing the right thing, right? Like, at least that, like, through the rage. And but yeah, you, because of the vehicle. And I was going to say, like, when people say, oh, it's just a car, you're just driving, calm down, you know. And more importantly, to your point, Alicia, they're not even thinking about you. It's not personal. Don't take it personal, as if that's the thing that enrages, right? When really it's something deeper, that you're in a system and you don't care about anybody or anything else, right? Like, it's an even deeper thing. And so, but then to be able to reflect on it, because I'm taking that rage and it becomes a teaching moment, and hopefully I can articulate it more and to other people, right? And so that's what I try to do with that energy.
Being so responsible with your rage.
Well, here's what it is, right? Like, the phrase, hope is a weapon, right? Rage is a weapon that'll kill you if you don't release it, right? If you don't use it. It's intended, right? The respectability politics, it's intended for you to be so ashamed of yourself, you trap it inside you. It's intended to kill you, you know? And so you can't do that. You can't let it kill you. But then if you just crash out, like the young people say, and you kill other people, then they also win, right? Then they also win on that other side. And so, like, the actual right answer is, it is a weapon and it's available to you to use and turn into kinetic energy.
Yeah. Jessica, how do you see rage being perceived generally, but also pretty specifically in the Bahamas, and when it is expressed by women?
Is it expressed by women? Are you allowed? How do I want to phrase that? I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is it's perceived as disrespectful, maybe. So while there's always that religious component of what's the word I want to use? Sort of proper behavior, love thy enemy. I might be quoting that wrong, but it's not women who are meant to be expressing anger, and it is perceived badly.
Patrice, can you talk a little bit about the expression of anger and who's allowed? Who's
Yeah,
allowed to do that?
I really like that Jessica used the word disrespectful, because I think that's a very powerful word. So the idea that if we look back at how we defined rage and we talked about movement and it being a weapon that's available to us, we talked about things like being explosive and uncontrolled. The idea that rage can be power, which would bring us to the question of who is allowed to express and experience power. So if we're not thinking, or if we believe in a society, a Caribbean region that's full of misogyny, that women are not supposed to wield power, we're not supposed to experience and express power, then angry women will be disrespectful, because we would be coming out of our lane by daring to rage. You're supposed to sit, you're supposed to be polite and quiet, and rage is not, it does not become her, you know, it's not something that we're supposed to be accessing, we're not supposed to be tapping into. So it would be disrespectful. We'd be violating the respectability politics. But not apart from that, along with that, the idea or the fear that we would be slipping into a zone that is none of our business. Why are we dabbling in rage? Why are we getting angry? We're starting to become threatening when we do that. So it makes me think a lot about who is allowed to experience and express power. And if we can see rage as a type of power, a weapon that's available to us, as Erin said, then it is very threatening when we start to rage, when we dare to defy the system and pick up that weapon or even look towards it. A lot of our social structures, a lot of our day-to-day oppressions rely on us staying quiet. And I know we've all had the experience of being a man sexually harassing us, and they do it in like this slow voice, like this little tiny voice. You can walk by and somebody could whisper something under their breath. And they're doing that with the assumption that we're not going to make an explosive scene, you know? So they're relying on the respectability politics. It's a woman, she's the only one that's going to be able to hear me, because we know there are all sorts of ways of sexually harassing, but I'm talking about the specific one where you walk by and they make the comment under the breath, only you and them hear. And they're relying on the fact that we are not taught to draw attention to the interaction. So it's very unlikely that a woman who has been well trained is going to shout out and say, "Will you just say, will you tell me?" and start making the scene. So that relying on our silence and our rage being controlled and made small to continue those sorts of harassing interactions.
I like what you just said, and it reminded me of once I showed anger to the most angry man I've ever met, and he said, "That wasn't very ladylike." And I was like, where's the lady? So I wanted to go back to, Patrice, something you said in the beginning about a sort of a raging hurricane. So it's uncontrollable, but there's that power to it, right? So I'll tell the story now. I have permission to tell the story. So a close friend of mine was in an abusive relationship a number of years ago, and said angry man, I witnessed 2 incidences, I want to say, and the first one, I froze. I didn't know what to do. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. He's an entire foot taller than me. I didn't know what to do. So I froze. And the next time I did not. And I want to preface this by saying this is not advice, and don't nobody do what I did. And every time Lauren or we do our bystander training, I think, wow, I didn't do that and I need to take this training. Anyway, we were set to go out all together, and I was quite happy because he was supposed to drive, so I didn't have to drive home. So that was great. Midway through preparing, he decides we're not doing that, and only promiscuous women go out at night. It was a whole thing. And I don't know if it was because I froze the first time, but seeing her, the beautiful, intelligent, confident firecracker of a woman, shake with fear and lock the door. I ended up driving. I locked her in my car. She was safe. I locked the door from the outside, and I just turned to him and I said, "What are you doing?" And I met his gaze. And he did threaten me, but nothing happened, and he just sort of left in a huff. And when I got back in the car, I was in a rage. I was angry. And I sat down, I looked at her, and her jaw's on the floor, and she's like, "What the hell were you doing?" And I went, "I don't actually know." Because I wasn't in control of whatever happened. I didn't, but I never saw him do it again. His approach to me is very soft now. She's out of the situation, so that's good. But I don't know, that moment of watching her, just my brain short-circuited, and that's never going to happen in my presence ever again. And here we are.
I thank you for sharing that story. I think we probably all have been in situations where some of us wish we could have done that some of us have done that and maybe wish we hadn't, or know that our response in the moment might have saved somebody, right? Like maybe not a whole life, but an experience that didn't need to happen. And I wanted to ask all of you about the usefulness of rage, because it often gets talked about as though it's just destructive. And it's in the definitions that you shared, it was about this lack of control. But what happens when you allow yourself to feel it, and you know it so well, and you know yourself so well that you can control it and you can use it for something? How do you get there? And do you have other examples of rage being useful for you?
Maybe it's not so bad that it's destructive. Maybe things want destroying. Maybe the system should be destroyed. I'm thinking back to the very visible, because we have had the Black Lives Matter uprisings and rebellions recently, and fuel, rage, and I was going to say pure rage, but there was so much more than rage, but there was also an integral component. It was very important to be in a rage. It was important to be furious to the point where, as activists, as feminists, as anyone who has some sort of consciousness around inequality of the world, we exist in a state of perpetual rage. But in moments of rebellion or uprising or a protest, it is as though the normal systems and structures that we navigate, that we can keep the rage below a certain point, the simmer, we can't keep it anymore. And then there's the bubble, the explosion. And I think that that's wholly necessary at times. And so there's room for it to be destructive. There's room for rage to explode and be uncontrollable. And I keep coming back to the word destroy, dismantle and uproot, and be in such a way that it cannot be ignored, because society will correct itself and shift back into its equilibrium of oppression. But if you have to really push against the boundaries, you have to be massive throngs, or in this particular instance, massive throngs that cannot be ignored. What the outcome of that is another discussion, but I think it has value in and out of itself, because another conversation that also comes up is, yeah, but what did it accomplish, you know? And I think that part of the conversation is meant to invalidate rage. So people will say things like, oh yes, there's all of that, but what was the outcome? That is a valid question. We all have to be strategic in activism so that there is something tangible in the end. But let's not invalidate that process. I think a part of that is to invalidate that process and to keep us silent by suggesting that if you just get angry and you shout, that is not a productive use of time. I think that is plenty productive, and it can be paired with more strategic intervention, yes. But sometimes things need to be destroyed. Keep noise, break it up, mash it up, as we would say in Barbados, mash up the thing. So yeah.
Some things just need disrupting.
Yeah.
Right. In some meeting spaces, there is no right conversation. There's no right application of the language. Even in the 15 minutes after I done tried to burn down the place, we all came together in Kumbaya. The space in and of itself is inappropriate and is evoking the violence that comes within. So broke it up, right? I experienced I experience rage in two ways, right? There is the rage that, like, Jessica, you do something superhero-esque because you actually cause a shift in someone, right? And I've had like that experience a couple of times with strangers and with people I know. But then there is the rage, you know, like the rage I have with traffic, right? There's that rage that I have a thing, and here's a part of it. I think I have pattern recognition syndrome. I don't call it disorder because I don't think it's a disorder, right? And so I also kind of know what your sentence is going to be after the first 6 or 7 seconds. And so I get like a frustration and like, hey, I'm telling you, trust me, we're in communion, trust me, you don't trust me. So that kind of thing is always there, but that a rage that caused me to see, right, that there's a pattern developing. And I'm pointing out the pattern and I'm pointing out the pattern, and there's a frustration that right that causes me to keep going, that turns into a rage that keeps pushing it forward, because like I could see what's forthcoming. I know what the stats are saying, right? But for me, it's also in that process is using the rage to create not just outrage, but a critical mass of outrage, right? Like, because if I'm feeling it, like, because you have to practice empathy and spatial awareness as well. If I'm feeling it, I know others are feeling it, right? And so it's a rage that kind of drives me to create a critical mass, create a space where those people are attracted and that rage becomes outrage. Right? So like I'll tell you all a little story. I was coming out of Johnson Road onto the Eastern Road, and Patrice, it's one of the weirdest and most dangerous intersections in the Bahamas, and they redid it a few years ago, and it's a little safer, but I'm coming out, it's a giveaway, so you don't have to come to a complete stop. Now I'm coming out and I come to a complete stop because there's traffic coming in both ways. And I see my mother approaching in a car, and she's coming westbound to turn into the intersection, and she stops her car completely. I figured that's my mother. She sees me, she can let me out the corner. She stops her car completely, and then 2 seconds later, she starts driving again. The vehicle behind her, a big truck, starts overtaking as I'm coming out. The vehicle behind him is also overtaking. I'm able to avoid the big truck. So now I'm angry because my mother is 79 and she shouldn't even be driving. And I didn't tell her drive better than, right? And this guy is just doing absolute foolishness, following blind. And we come like this close to each other. This is the camera that close to each other. And I turn and I look at him and I ask him, what you doing? And he starts cussing me. And I look at him and I say, big man, I will pick you and your tiny ass car up and throw it in the bush right over there. And that rage, like it stunned him so much that you could see him kind of deflate, like kind of calm down. Like, I can't believe, what the hell? Hold on, what did the woman just tell me? That's the type of rage like I have, make me think I could pick up a car and throw it in the bush.
Erin, I've had many moments like that, and I think it's extra funny to them because I'm 5'2", soaking wet. I wanted to say that I agree that there's space for rage to just be about destruction. And while it might not be super helpful for you to fling somebody's car in the bush, correct me if I'm wrong, Alicia, but was this group not formed as a result of rage? So it's not flinging somebody's car in the bush, but we're doing something.
Right, but creating a channel, systems for people to plug into, whether, and in the best instance, whether consciously or unconsciously, right? That rage becomes an outrage that creates community and gives people agency.
Yeah, we have some chat activity, and I'm going to come to the hand right after I just read this little engagement in case any of you would like to respond. So someone asked, are there healthy forms of rage, and are there outlets for unavoidable day-to-day frustrations? And someone actually replied, is rage supposed to be healthy? What do we mean by healthy? Shouldn't rage just be considered a part of human nature, something that just is?
I think that rage just is, but the expression of it is what could be healthy versus unhealthy. So flinging somebody's car in the bush. I'm so sorry, Erin. I'm going to use that example all the time. Randomly leaving work and punching somebody in the face, not great. Going home and writing a letter to your MP, or there's ways to express it that could be labeled healthy or unhealthy, but the thing itself is, it just is. And you could argue that the thing itself, anger, rage, is healthy. It's necessary. It's the thing that motivates you to do something. Sometimes some people might get pissed off and turn their life around and start eating healthy and rock climbing, and all of that's anger.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And please use the example, right? And that's why I use it. The rage in itself is an appropriate response. I'm not a therapist. I'm only a professional foolishness talker. But when people talk about depression, I say the world is depressing. The circumstances that people are living in, and then we as society, implicitly force them to consider as normal, right? Because then we wanna remove our obligation as a community member, right? In the broader sense. And in the same way, rage is an appropriate response. And I think when we get to the point that we're having these discussions, then it really should be the beacon, the highlight that something is fundamentally wrong, right? And if we're willing, and I think this is the part here, if we're willing to practice the empathy, and so of course it's important to sit with our rage, right? But are we prepared to sit with other people's rage? When I thought that this was going to be more like I had to give a presentation, I was thinking deeply about Buju Banton and the song Boom Bye Bye, right? And learning about it and how it came about. And I thought, look, if we understood that this was a song by a 14-year-old that was responding to pervasive sexual violence in the communities he was living in, and violence against young people and vulnerable people, then what became the Stop Murder Music campaign, right, may have been the Stop Rape and Sharing campaign. But we weren't prepared to sit in the rage and to understand what is evoking it. And I mean, as a gay person, I say, yeah, people have the feelings about Boom Bye Bye, but it's also a 14-year-old, right? Like my whole life, I thought an adult wrote the song, and then I realized a 14-year-old, I practiced a bit of empathy. And they said, well, what is a 14-year-old doing, having experienced coincidentally or directly so much sexual violence that they write in a song about shooting gay people in the head, right? And so a big part of it is, will we do the work of preparing ourselves psychologically, right? To do the self-care, that work that we have to do to then be able to sit in the rage as community members and then as advocates, right? And policymakers, like in that space, like what are we going to do? How are we going to do this work? Because that's where the understanding is. And a part of the reason we're failing is because we don't really understand the roots of some of the problems.
And, yeah, the question about about rage as healthy, etc. The conversation about rage is a touchy conversation because it's also a conversation about violence. So when we talk about expression of rage, we talk about the best way to express it. And often it is difficult because we're on a public forum, we're in a public space. I am always having this battle in my mind about what to say when it comes to violence, because being recorded personally, professionally, it does not seem like a positive thing to say to someone, like if you're advocating for violence, right? So then I feel the tension or the pressure to say something like, I understand that rage is important and it is a natural and normal emotion, but I would not advise anyone to channel that rage into violence or anything like that. But I don't know if I actually believe that. I think that oppressive systems are inherently violent, and violence takes many forms. And just because it is not a chop or a stab, it does not mean that we're not existing in states where violence is being consistently perpetuated against us. And no one has ever gained liberation by asking politely. So sometimes blood gotta shed. I am a descendant of one of the plantations in Barbados where the enslaved people on that plantation slit the slave master's throat. So that is in my ancestry. But then it becomes a very tense, uncomfortable space where people are, wait, she's saying you should be violent. She's saying you should be doing this thing or not. But am I not existing under oppressive violence? But we're only defining violence as resistance. When we resist, we're being violent. But the day-to-day misogyny, the day-to-day sexism and racism and white supremacy, is that not also violent? Are we going to treat our violent resistance in the same way that we're going to treat the violent oppression that we face? Are we going to ask politely for freedom? So I think that in conversations about rage, those are a lot of the things that are unsaid. Because if we talk about rage and how we channel it, then we're going to talk about violence. And then are we saying that we support violence? That is something you should not say. But I never said that I am committed to like nonviolent activism. So there's that.
Patrice, just following up on what you said, right? Like, so you're in that conversation and non-conversation, right? And then I want to say to them, listen, I understand that just the consideration of these things feels violent to you, but that should then show you how violent, right? The silence is, the invisibilization of the reality is, that you're forcing upon us. Anyway, yeah, I just wanted to say that, but I couldn't say it with a Bayesian accent.
And Patrice, I'm glad you brought that up because this is something that has come up a lot over the last year and a little bit in conversations about Palestine, right? About the genocide of the Palestinian people and the expectation that they're just supposed to lie down and take it, and the demonization of the resistance because it is not a nonviolent resistance. And for folks who haven't seen it, you can take a look at a Caribbean feminist statement in support of Palestine and Palestinians. You can find it at tiny.cc/Caribbean for Palestine, I think is the link. I'll double check it and put it in the chat. And yes, free Palestine. I think there was one more bit in the chat that I wanted to make sure you all saw. It's not only about the impact on a perpetrator in the moment, it's also about the destruction of the internal patriarchal programming within our bodies. And I think this was around the time that Jessica was sharing that story. And it's such a great point. I often think about this when, not necessarily in rage, but when we engage with people who are clearly the opposition and actually don't want to learn anything, but it's in a public forum, sometimes it's worthwhile to continue the engagement because we know that people are watching. We know that people who are undecided or who want more information are paying attention to the conversation. So sometimes the conversation isn't for the other person on the other end, it's for the other people. And sometimes the rage isn't just to make a point to the person who is doing something ridiculous, but it's also sort of a validation of the people who are experiencing their violence, the people who are the survivors and the victims as well.
I'm glad you said that. And I know that you had that moment where somebody came to you later and said, I'm so glad you said that because I couldn't. And I do that all the time, and people often say, did you have to say that? But other people will say, I'm so glad you said that. He needed to hear that. And that's all I need to not shut my mouth. So
not only that, like being on the radio, I think the political class is sorely unaware of itself and the impact what's taken up. And so some of the conversations I have are about like trying to make them aware of themselves for their own good, right? And to prevent violence, right? So they could, and so I get people that come up to me and kind of admonish me for making fun of politicians. And I'd be like, look here, I don't know. I don't know what to do with that, buddy. I think I'm gonna have to turn it into a joke, because it's just, it's just so wild. But like in that space, and sometimes the people who we don't know are victims. It's empowering for them to hear that somebody sees, somebody understands, and then is still talking about it in a way that doesn't lead to further victimization. And sometimes that rage from somebody else done in the right way helps to do that.
Good point. Ternille, you've been waiting for a while. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you guys for the discussion. I just wanted to chime in. 10 years ago, we had a member of parliament in the Bahamas who made a joke in quotations about beating a woman. And so our group, Bahamas Against Sexual Violence and Child Abuse, decided that we would petition the Prime Minister to address that situation through public awareness campaign, denouncing the joke publicly, getting sensitivity training from members of parliament, donating to the crisis center. That request went with no response. So at some point I just was like, well, we need to demonstrate. So me, Lisi, and the 25 the rest of us went to Rawson Square by Parliament and had our picket signs and said violence against women is not funny. And I had like friends who would post on Facebook like, why y'all out there getting all sweaty up and thing? So I felt like a bit embarrassed about it because like being a recording artist turned activist, I was like, but people sure ain't taking us seriously. But when I inserted myself into a gender-based violence task force meeting and asked them why they weren't speaking up about it, I learned from Erin Greene, Erin's mom, who was, I think she's a counselor with the crisis center or a lawyer with the crisis center. She said to Neil, since your guys were out there for the past few weeks, we've been having an uptick of older women calling the crisis center hotline saying that they were in abusive relationships. So that, to me, made up for the fact that people thought we was out there sweating up ourselves, beating up our gums for no reason. And it caused us to continue to use protesting and demonstrating as one form of channeling the rage that we have and trying to expand the reach, just not as individuals, but as groups. And so we continued for the past decade to demonstrate when we thought it necessary or when we needed to make a public stance.
Thanks for sharing that. It also connects to the more recent point too about not necessarily doing it for the audience that it looks like you're trying to attract, right? But also capturing other people who are attentive and who can learn something or get a useful resource. It's something to keep in mind because I think we can get caught up on our own intentions and forget about the sort of unintended benefits of taking action.
And I'm also hearing in there the willingness, because I believe Ternille used the word that she felt embarrassed, the willingness to put yourself out there, because in a forum, if you respond loudly or angrily, or you show rage, it might be embarrassing. It might be you are stepping out of the accustomed norms of the space. You're making yourself very visible. Attention is going to be drawn towards you. And not wanting attention and scrutiny is one of the tools used to keep people quiet. People will sit there thinking, I feel so angry, I have something to say, but then when people hear me, everybody's going to be looking, suppose people are judging me, etc. And that's similar to a public demonstration. People are going to see, people are going to judge. I'm going to put myself out there. Is it worth it? Should I just keep my head down and keep going in the public space, in the public demonstration? So both of those are about instances where you have to decide. You don't really care how it looks. I don't care how it looks if I'm angry. I don't care who's judging me. I don't care who's going to be like, you look at how she getting on. Or I don't care. Or even if I do care, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to go to that square and hold up the signs anyway and look at the impact that it did have.
And it's a tool here in the Bahamas. The people are very savvy, right? So it's not just like an uncomfortability and then a shaming. It's a tool that's used in spaces to diminish what it is you're saying, right? The suggestion that you should be embarrassed, or that we're going to embarrass you for doing something that we actually probably did at some point also. And so don't even feel like, when you say embarrassed, don't feel shame and don't feel embarrassed, because that's it's a contrived state, right? Like it's contrived to make you stop.
Yeah. Dylan.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, my question is, as a guy, I understand now that like that the patriarchy kind of runs on rage manufactured in other men to be directed towards women, or of course, um, kind of like the punching bags in a society. But my question is, are there healthier forms of rage we could easily turn men towards? Like, um, yeah, that's the question.
Alicia, if I could, I really want to tout the power of creative spaces, right? To help people not just sort of get the rage out of their bodies in a healthy way, but also to use that rage, right? To turn into kinetic energy, to turn into outrage. And it's a bit selfish, right? Because I think that when we take that rage to that creative space, then it creates a political agency, right? It creates a political, not voting agency, but political agency, where people can begin to make healthier choices and decisions for themselves. That's what I think, that's what's born out of rage becoming outrage in creative spaces. I really want to tout that. And to write individually is great, right? That's obviously a respect, accepted and respected, effective process. But then to also try to connect, even if you're just trying to connect to other people through your writing, or connect to other writers and writing about the same thing, or writing about different things from the same space, right? It really is a powerful tool. And it's the thing. Improv, I say, improv saved my life, right? Improv saved my life, but more importantly, it saved your lives. I like to put it like that. It saved you all from right, a different type of a rage and destruction. And I think advocates can create spaces for that. Yeah, I see. And this 16 days of advocacy is filled with those types of spaces for people to come together
Right.
and express rage in a way that we can build a critical mass of outrage and create something positive.
Hmm. Okay. Makes sense.
And I think if we're thinking of how men specifically can express rage in a healthier way, I would encourage them all to work on their emotional intelligence, because they're socialized to sort of only express anger, full stop. That's the end of the list of, that's the end of the emotional range you're sort of supposed to have. But
Yeah.
there's something is under the anger. So if I want to briefly go back to Patrice, you talked about how rage feels in your body. And then Alicia, you said something about the superhero thing. And for me, rage starts right here. So this is at my side. It's always, and then it's heat. And then I feel like I'm not 5'2". And that's how anger, you would swear. I have like Superman's what is this? Build. So learning how it feels in your body, learning what is under the anger. So something else is there. Learning what triggers it, learning how to calm it down, all of those things. But really, what's under it? Because there's something there. And taking that step back to think, why am I feeling this rage, can be very helpful.
And I would add to that too. Also think about who the target of your rage should be. And this is a conversation that I've been having with some men who are friends recently, who are on that process of recognizing patriarchy for what it is and wanting to unpack patriarchy and misogyny, but becoming frustrated when they believe that they're making attempts and those attempts are not being received well by women, etc. I mean, I don't have much patience for people who demand ally cookies, but this is not about that. What I'm saying is that if a man is in that position where he feels as though he is making a genuine attempt to unpack and deconstruct and live in a more egalitarian way, but that is not being received in the way he hopes that it would be received, whose fault is that? It is not the fault of women and girls. It is the fault of other men who have created a system that is so terrible and is so oppressive that women and girls continue to be fearful in the face of someone who appears to be trying to be different, because we don't have the luxury, women, girls, gender expansive people, we don't have the luxury of giving people a chance. We would then end up losing our lives. So you can be angry, you can have that rage, but who are you directing it towards? It's not supposed to be directed towards women and girls. These women and girls would not give me a chance. We out here trying and they won't give us a chance. It should be directed to the other men who have made conditions so horrible and so horrific that we don't have the luxury of giving a chance. So there is that rage, but to whom it is directed is really important. And so I always give the example because, you know, if you're having a conversation with men, especially Black men in the Caribbean region, they tend to understand examples to do with race. So then I have to put it in race terms to make it more palatable, which is aggravating to me, but that is also another conversation. So we put it in race terms. So I say, take, for example, a Black man in the USA pulled over by a white cop. And that white cop sees himself as a good guy. He does community policing, etc. If that Black man is angry, scared, shaken, fears that he will become another hashtag, whose fault is that? It's not on the white cop to be vexed with him and say, how dare you think that I could kill you? Well, 400 years says that you will kill me. Therefore, it's understandable that I am not receiving your overtures nicely. The context is not one where I should be safe around you. And if you want to be an ally, you should understand that Black man's fear, that Black man's discomfort, not trying to talk him out of it, and then direct your rage as a white cop to an entire system of white supremacy and police brutality that makes that Black man feel that way. And it's the same thing with women. Be angry, but direct it to the other men who created this situation and not to the women and girls. And that's not to suggest that you are directing it towards women and girls. It's our first time meeting. But I'm saying that that's something that's coming up recently for me when men are looking agitated and angry and frustrated. Be agitated and angry and frustrated. But with the other men who make it so, I'm not in a position to give you a chance.
Wow.
A whole word. Copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste on all the platforms everywhere.
You know what?
I find myself using, sorry, go on, Erin.
No, you go on, because I was going to talk about the bear versus a man and the rage that was expressed post that. So you go on.
Well, what came up during your sermon, Patrice, is that two things. If you're enraged that you're not getting the ally cookies, which love that phrase, what's under that? Why do you feel entitled to praise because you're doing what you should have been doing from your born? So that's what's under that also needs to be addressed, number one. And number two, I also hate that I too often end up using the race example, but I always put myself in it. So I'm like, say I go somewhere and I'm the cop in this analogy, and I was like, how stupid would I look if I say, well, I'm not like the rest of them, so you're supposed to be comfortable around me. And that's when they almost sort of get it. And I'm like, I understand if a person of color is apprehensive around me, and I don't internalize that as a personal slight. I know the history of why that happens, and I'm just gonna get over it in the moment. Man versus bear, Erin, let's go.
I thought the whole kind of thought experiment was fascinating, but the rage it evoked in men and women, and not a desire to understand why, right? Like, my thing is like, why? The rage that's evoked when people say they believe in a flat Earth,
Erin, you
right?
could
Like,
go back a little bit and just give a little context for what the bear versus man is for anyone who's not very online.
okay, so I think Bear versus Man was a thought experiment where women were asked, if you were alone in a forest, who would you prefer, or what would you prefer to encounter, a bear or a man? And many women instinctively answered a bear. A bear. I prefer to encounter a bear. And men and some women were outraged. I mean, they were hot. How stupid are you? Y'all just hate men. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, y'all women need to go to another planet because this ain't making no sense. As opposed to pausing for a second and asking themselves, in a situation where you've seen The Revenant, that's that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where he had to fight the bear. Like, why would you choose a bear versus a man? And so, right, then you flip it and you say to that man because he's placed himself in the equation, right? Like, because he's saying, why would you choose a bear over me? I'm a nice guy, right? And then you say, but you weren't even nice enough to pause for a second and think about my feelings. Like, did you pause for a second? Like, what is it that this woman experienced? And then because when you start there, then you would say, oh yeah, because the stats are like 1 in every 4 women experience sexual violence in their lifetime, right? And then you go further in your thinking without being prompted by anybody, right? And so it was just interesting, the rage that the question evoked. And so it's the same thing for me with a number of things, like people who believe there's a flat Earth, right? Like, I'm less concerned that they believe, and I want to know what has led you to this belief. That's what's more, I think, fascinating and important in terms of the discussion.
I like that you mentioned curiosity, because that's a big conflict resolution always approach with curiosity, and that you're not likely to sort of run headfirst into anger. I like that you brought up the movie The Revenant. Is that the name of it? Because while we've seen that, we've also seen I Spit on Your Grave, which is where a woman is violently sexually assaulted, and we've seen this movie and that movie and that movie of the same thing. So the numbers aren't really on your side. And I often use the race comparison in that one too, because I would say if a Black man said he would rather encounter a Black woman or a white woman in the woods and he chose, not me, I would think, okay, you've had a bad experience. I would not think, how dare you insult me? The other thing that came up too is we don't have woods and we don't have bears, but we have ocean and we have sharks. And I've encountered sharks in the wild at least 3 times. Every single time, I didn't exist to them. They didn't look in my direction, thank God, because one of them was bigger than me. Nothing happened. Of the handful of times I've encountered a strange man on the beach, it did not go well. So just to say, listen to people's stories.
Yeah, I think, living on this western side of the world and being in the Bahamas, and I think consumed by global North media, it's easy to forget what other people's realities are. I'm in this kind of very bougie group, and somebody tried to evoke a conversation about what happened to 12-year-old Moxie Adriel, and to hear these people talk, right, like that people are living this way, and I just have to be quiet, like this at Rage, right? But I know this is not the place to express it. I need to find a savvier way to express it for my own good, right? Like my own safety, lest I be victimized some more. But that is enraging, this vapidness, this blindness, the way that people have been able to invisibilize, and a part of that is the way that we consume the global North media, the most predominant media,
We are still open for questions, comments, ideas, and challenges. Folks can raise hands if you'd like to unmute, or you can use the chat to share your contributions. Also, those watching on Facebook, you can use the comments there if you'd like to share anything.
I don't know how many people are aware, but the statistic worldwide is that 50% of all sexual assaults happen to girls under the age of 15. That's a very troubling thing. And the mothers, the women, the aunties seem to be the only ones who can find a way to respond to that. But I feel like in the Bahamas, we have a high rate of child murder, stray bullets, baby Bella abused to death, the recent Adriel situation. And we feel very frozen and unable to respond in any sort of effective way. And then the news cycle is going to just run up. Like about a week later, things are going to just go back to normal, and it's like it never happened. So the fact that these things happened during the 16, like close to this 16 days of activism is even more, I don't know, it feels like such a strange coincidence, but it's almost like, what can people do? I see some child protection activists now calling for capital punishment. A lot of outraged at the lack of the response time when it comes to the Marcos alert being disseminated. The child protection petition by Rise Bahamas that was started about a year ago now has about 3,000 signatures. And we're calling for stiffer penalties, but including mandatory minimum sentences, because any rape of a child, statutory rape, regular rape, can get up to a life sentence. But we've seen in recent times, in June, a man was sentenced, and he took a plea deal. He got a 2-year sentence per rape charge, 2 years for raping a 13-year-old girl. And he raped her 3 times, so he got a 6-year sentence. So I don't understand what we're dealing with in the Bahamas, but it's almost like, who is coming to save us? Nobody. How can we save ourselves? How can we sustain this action beyond the 16 days of activism? Like, what can we really do to get the international attention that we need to understand that we have an epidemic of child abuse and child sexual abuse in our country? So I think there's no better panel than to try to maybe figure out what we could do than the people who are in this group right now.
I have a question that might bounce off of that. May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. To what extent can we like tackle that problem by like informing, like to what extent do we think that men are not aware that the patriarchal system doesn't actually help them? Because when I think about it, all these years of men having this just tremendous artificial privilege over women, it's kind of robbed men of a lot of time they could have been like spending actually developing their like emotional and interpersonal intelligence and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So to what extent do we like need to educate men that, I mean, I guess it's got to come to that point anyway, but like educate men that take the patriarchy and patriarchal practices of masculinity aren't actually helpful for like, you know, sustainable relationships in society and whatnot. Like what kind of relearning are we talking about here?
Like to respond to both Tennille and Dylan before I have to go, the stat that you read, Tennille, that 50% of victims of sexual violence, assault, are girls under the age of 15 or 13, right? So what that suggests is that if I'm 48, that's what, 2 generations that you're in. You know, what it suggests is that the traumatized parents who experience violence that hasn't been processed properly are raising kids, and kids who are now vulnerable to, right, and being represented in the statistic. The people are essentially victims. They're victims of a system that is bigger than them. And so a part of it is like understanding that people have at this point normalized a lot of what is actually trauma, because they have to see themselves as normal. They have to see themselves as normal and as whole as to continue, right? And so I think a big part of it is how do you make the shift where you say to people, say, look here, we ain't good, but we could be good, right? Like this is not normal. This behavior, because the we is important, right? And not excluding yourself. We are not normal, but we gonna be good, like that we're in a process of healing, because like that's the way it works. For men specifically, men are living in the same ecosystem. So when we begin that work, then boys are also benefactors, right, of that shift in culture. But a big part of it is talking about it. And I think like my biggest vice is not doing the self-care work so I could be more present for other people, right? Like a lot of the work that I do is in my head. And so I'm sitting with people empathetically and not sitting with people with their hand in my hand drinking tea. And listening in that way. Sometimes I do. I find I'm doing that more often, but that we create space by us first being vulnerable and healing, like as advocates, people committing to doing the work and being vulnerable, or as community members and people committing to being in community with one another and being honest and finding gentle ways, because when you understand that people are also victims, you can't mash them down with the rage, because that's exactly what the system intends to happen. But listen, I gotta go, guys. I want to thank you all very, very much for this and allowing me to be on the panel. Thank you very, very much. Patrice, Jessica, all the people in the comments, thank you very, very much. And I'm gonna translate this into, my conversations on the radio as well.
Thank you, Erin. We will see you next time.
Bye, Erin. Thank you. The last question that was raised, well, the comment about the history of it, I think there is an actual answer to that. You'd have to check in with the historians and feminists that study the history of it, the history of gender-based oppression. I don't want to give inaccurate information, but I do think it has to do with private property, and when property stopped being communal and started being private, and inheritance and controlling who was giving birth, etc. So I'm sure there is a historically based answer to when it was more beneficial to be oppressive based on gender. I just don't have the details of it, and I don't want to give wrong information. The question about patriarchy hurting men and boys as well, I know that to be true. I work with adolescent boys in my mental health work. I have spent a lot of time working with adolescent groups. And though I can see that, I also even want us to take a step back and interrogate that premise. Why is it that we say that? Do we say that patriarchy hurts men and boys because we believe that primarily, or do we say that because it makes the movement more palatable to men and boys? As in, you have to basically tell men and boys that there's something in it for them in order to make the movement palatable. How about if the movement was primarily about liberating women and girls and gender diverse people from patriarchal oppression? Is that not enough? And in many cases, it isn't. So even within the patriarchy, there's this, like, you have to make the messaging appealing to men. So we have to say, okay, yeah, men are benefiting most from patriarchy in every way. We can talk about family structures, we can talk about economic structures, we can talk about history, we can talk about political power. This is capitalism. We can talk about money. We can talk about all of the ways that patriarchy benefits men. We can also talk about the fact that often what is harmful. Did something
Go on,
happen?
Patrice.
Go ahead, Patrice. Someone was unmuted. Go ahead.
Right, sorry. Yeah, we can also talk about the fact that if we look at situations along a continuum, many of the harmful aspects of patriarchy are many of the ways in which men are harmed by patriarchy. Along the continuum of that harm leads to a privilege. Along the continuum of that particular harm leads to a privilege. So for example, the idea that men are not allowed to express emotions other than anger. Along that emotion continuum is the privilege of being seen as rational, logical, and able to rule the world. So often when you point to an area where men are harmed by patriarchy, there is a privilege that tends to counteract that. So it's not as simple as saying men aren't allowed to show emotions. There is significant and tremendous privilege, the kind of privilege that allows you to win an election, and being told that you are reasonable and logical and your emotions are the ones that should be in control. And if women are on their period, they're going to press the button and kill the world with the nuclear codes, all of that rhetoric. So that is something that I think would be useful to interrogate. If we're talking about a system of white supremacy and we want to dismantle that, it's because we want people of color to be liberated. When we talk about systems of queerphobia and heterosexism, and we want to dismantle that, it's because we want gender expansive people to be liberated. If we talk about systems of patriarchy and we want to dismantle that, it's because we want women and girls to be liberated. That is not to say that men will not benefit as well from people being able to be their more full and complete selves. But why is the message in that? Why is it that we have to convince men and boys that patriarchy is bad for them too in order to make them care? And isn't that very problematic in and of itself?
When Erin was talking about people's reaction to Adriel Moxie's mother and how it speaks to, you know, the bubble that they live in, I wanted to make the point that a lot of people find it very hard to just get out of their own head in order to see other people's experience. So
Yeah. Sorry.
Why is it not, like Patrice says, why is it not enough that it's harming women? Why do you also need to know that it's harming you? And going back to, not you specifically, you, Dylan, but going back to, I remember coming across a video of a cis woman saying that transphobia can often harm cis women because she received death threats from a transphobic person. And, you know, people in the comments were saying, wow, I didn't know this. And this put a lot of things into perspective. And did you really need to hear that to know that this is a problem. So yeah, everything Patrice said.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I did ask that to respond to Patrice. I did ask that from the thinking of like it being, feminism being made more palatable to us men. That is what I was thinking. So would you say it does make sense? And it is kind of whack, but it seems hard to like kind of reason at that level. Like with the issue with Palestine right now, it seems disconnected, but trying to like argue that it does affect us seems not to be working. Like it hurts our humanity. Doesn't seem to be working right now. So that's what I was thinking. Thank you, both of you. Oh, everyone.
We have some comments in the chat. Keeping in rage and pretending it's not important or taboo to express it is damaging to both mental and physical health for women. The links between women being stressed and it translating to autoimmune diseases are being made. It's scary that 80% of persons with autoimmune diseases are women. Still learning about the subject and would like to know what you think about that.
That's messed up.
It is definitely scary that 80% of people who have autoimmune diseases are women. But I mean, stress affects the body. There's the same physical response that you have to anger or some other kind of emotion. It shows that it is in your body. It lives there and it needs to be expressed. Like Erin said, for your sake and for the sake of others.
We have another comment that we have so many problems and broken systems that it can be overwhelming. I think it's about trying to figure out which actions can have the most important impact and spur more action. And doing that when you're fighting masters who are not going to make it easy to destroy their houses, to borrow from Audre Lorde.
The comment that was made earlier about women experiencing the rage and turning it inward and all of the stressors that come with that and how it damages our mental health and damages our physical health. I think one of the things that propels me in my activism is that I tell myself that I would rather people be angry with me than for me to be angry with myself for not having intervened in a way that I am proud of after. I remember when I was young on UV campus, and I had this conversation with someone about homophobia. He was being very homophobic, and I did not feel like I could articulate it properly. I was trying to argue back. I was trying to push back, but I guess it was too young. I didn't have the words. And I thought about that. Clearly, I'm still thinking about that. So that was so long ago, and I kept thinking I should have said this and I could have said that, and why didn't the words come in the moment? And so in all of the spaces that I've been in since then, I can still see his face upstairs in the library looking smug. I think about that. If I am about to take the mic, or I'm trying to decide, should I actually say something? That is the measure in my head. Am I going to be annoyed with myself for not having said anything? Am I going to turn this inward? Because if people in the room get annoyed with me for naming an uncomfortable truth or saying something that people don't want to hear, or saying an uncomfortable truth, saying something that people don't want to hear, I can live with that. I'm going to go home and they're going to go home. But if I don't say it, or if I cop out, I guess, I'm going to be angry with me, and I'm going to think about that, and I'm going to ruminate. And you have to be strategic. It's not every moment that you will choose to intervene. You'll weigh your balance and decide, you know what, I'm not me today. It got to be somebody else today, and that's also fine. But I have found that has been a very powerful measure that helps me in terms of rage. I don't want to turn my rage on me. I'd rather you be mad at me and I be happy with what I did. And that has really helped over the years.
Patrice, same. The two incidences that I referenced earlier in our debrief after the big incident, I said to her that the first time when I froze and did nothing is like one of the biggest shames of my life. And my life wasn't exactly super boring. And she looked at me and she was like, what the hell were you gonna do? She didn't view it as that I should have stepped in, but I hated my reaction. I was not proud of my reaction. So the next time I was like, I'm gonna walk away proud of my reaction. And I did. And thankfully, nothing happened to me. And I think I sort of know why. I knew him well enough to know it wasn't, but I use that same rule of thumb is, am I gonna be angry at myself later? Am I gonna hate that I reacted this way and be ashamed? And quite often the only consequence that I have is these people who make these comments know not to make them when I walk in the room, and they'll say, I can't say this stuff in front of Jessica. And no, you can't. You certainly can't. But same. I'd rather you be mad at me than me be mad at me or ashamed of me. You could be ashamed of me too and angry, and I could live with that.
I'm thinking about your example, Patrice, with Library Boy, and thinking of all the people who have these kinds of experiences, these kinds of engagements where they are pissed off, they fundamentally disagree, but they aren't sure that they can make the argument. And I think a lot of people are in this position where they do not speak up because they feel like they don't have the language. They feel like there are, for sure, certain points that are going to be made that they can't refute. Do you have guidance for people in these situations?
Oh, I did not think that was where the question was going. I was going to say that that's why I feel an even greater responsibility to speak in those moments. Because I feel like if I do have the language, I've been saying it for many years and I am practiced in saying it. So I have those people in my mind too. But in answer to your actual question, the guidance would be like the more philosophical type guidance is that saying where you say speak the truth even if your voice shakes. So even if it is not the most eloquent, if you don't have everything you want to say laid out point by point very articulately, you will still be a thorn in this person's side. And that, in other words, if that person feels as though they can come into space and make misogynistic comments and sexist comments and have a smooth path without any challenge, even if your challenge to them is not the most eloquent, the fact that you have mounted that challenge has put a roadblock in their path. They have to stop, they have to address it, there is resistance. It did not go as smoothly as they thought. It was not as unchecked as they thought. And they still had to step back. They still had to respond. They still had to take thought. And that is something, you know? I remember before there used to be a lot of arguments in Facebook comment sections. I'm sure there still are, but I'm not on Facebook as much anymore. But even though the person goes back and forth, what I always said is that you made it difficult for them. They thought they would just make that comment and that comment would stay there and it would be filled with agreement. But the fact that you engage under the post made it harder. And even if they go back and forth with you, they will think twice the next time that they're going to make that status. Because it's like, well, the last time it caused a whole set, they might still make it, but they're no longer assured that it will be a smooth path. So that's the more philosophical advice. The more practical advice is that many arguments or many misogynistic statements and sexist ones are really not original. They're very repetitive. They're very predictable. I can tell you word for word what sort of feedback I would get if I was on a panel about gender-based violence. I know what the resistance looks like. I know what the comments look like. I know what the feedback will be. I know who will raise their hand and say, what about the man? So if that person does think that they're going to be in spaces like that often, you can prepare yourself with actual information. You can preempt certain comments, but because you know they're going to come, so you can frame your presentation in a way that already cuts those people up. You know what I mean? So the feedback, even though racists and misogynists think they're very brilliant and very original, the comments are very repetitive, very unoriginal, very stale, is the same rehashed feedback over and over. So you can actually prepare yourself to address those comments because you're pretty sure what's going to come. And there is material out there. There are people that you can listen to. So you can feel confident that, oh, if they say this, then I can say that. If they say this, I can say that. So that would be my advice to those people. Speak the truth, even if your voice shakes, and then educate yourself for the inevitable. What about the man?
Yeah, the predictability can definitely work in our favor once we're prepared to speak, right? And to be uncomfortable because you're uncertain, you're not in complete control of the conversation, but you can kind of prepare talking points because of the predictability of it. Does anyone have any questions about these talking points or these arguments and things that you want to kind of prepare yourself to respond to? And I see your hand, Dylan, but I want to make sure that we're making space for any women that might want to unmute and speak before I come to you. Or any other questions or comments, really. Anyone want to really go out there and say, I don't know how to respond to this thing? Help. I know we get the whataboutism a lot about men and this idea that, and I think this is in Barbados and across the region too, that men and boys are the ones that are in trouble. They're being left behind. The women and the girls have all the jobs. What is your response to that kind of rhetoric and hand wringing, Patrice? Yeah.
Well, a lot of my sessions are specifically on gender-based violence. So I often talk about, and I do this at the beginning. I don't wait until the question comes up because I know that the question is going to come up. So in my sessions about gender-based violence, I talk more generally about resistance to new learning and why we might have that resistance. And then I talk about the fact that we're not just talking about violence in general. We're speaking about a specific type of violence that is committed on the basis of gender. And when we talk about specific types of violence on the basis of race, gender, membership of a particular group, then it requires a specific type of conversation. And usually the presentation has gender. Every time I have the word gender on the presentation is in red. So it keeps saying that this is a conversation about gender-based violence. And then the slide says something like, when we talk about the different types of violence committed on the basis of gender, and I have them all listed out, and I think that that is actually quite helpful. So I have like acid attacks, honor killings, female genital mutilation, like when you have all of them, I say these ones are the ones that are likely to affect women and girls, and men and boys are the ones that tend to be the perpetrators. So yes, I will acknowledge that all people can commit violence and all people can be victims of violence. But when we're talking about gender-based violence, perpetrators are typically men and victims are women, girls, members of the LGBTQI+ community. And then I'm unapologetic about that. I say it is intellectually dishonest for us to pretend that men and women are affected equally by gender-based violence, or that we need to have a conversation about balance, because there is no balance. So that comes pretty early up in the presentation. And when it is put out there and it's not, we don't wait on the back end for somebody to raise their hand and say, what about the men? Then it becomes clear that this conversation is being had in this way because of these truths. Some people still try, but it hits a little different, because then some people in the group are like, did you not just hear what she said? Like, so you have some support from the group when you are also unapologetic about the facts. And yeah, that has been that. And the hand wringing about men and boys being left behind. Sometimes I express curiosity about which areas they're being left behind in. So it is easy to say in general, oh, we're leaving boys behind. So then I would want to know, is it that it's difficult to be a political leader if you're a man? Is it that it's difficult to be a priest if you're a man? Is it that it's difficult to be on an executive board as a man? So men are being excluded from leadership positions and positions of power? Is it that, like, to have them really articulate, you know, the different social spaces, how are men being marginalized in those? Men are finding it hard to become president, like where and how, and then yeah, I think the point becomes clear.
So anticipating, laying it out from the beginning and setting
Breaking
it
it
up
down,
so that
yeah, I'm breaking it down into, you know, you're just repeating that, but in what ways? And then is it only because of masculinity, or is it that masculinity is intersecting with another identity? So I can accept that if you're talking about poor men or Black men, but not just, you know, like a blanket, oh, a man is like, okay, yeah, there can be the intersection with other oppressed identities like queer men. And we can go there, but not just like, oh, I can never be prime minister because when in the history of which Caribbean country?
yeah, forcing that articulation can slow the roll a little bit. We have more in the chat. In the beginning, Patrice, you made a remark on mental health, which sparked a thought. What are we working toward when it comes to mental health in a fundamentally unjust society? Do we even have an estimate to understand what it means to be in a state of mental health and recognizing that different bodies people might have in relation to health? And how could that inform our choices to build community?
I can respond, and then I'm sure Jessica can jump in as well, given her expertise. A fundamentally unjust society, agreed. And that's kind of why I'm doing this work. It surprises people because therapy is seen as something that's so individually focused, it's one-on-one, but very early, I recognized that I did not just want to teach people to cope in an unjust world. I did not want to put that responsibility on them to cope in a fundamentally unjust society. I wanted to do what I could to change the society around them in whatever little way, because that is unfair. It is unfair to locate the problem just within the person and tell them that it's only because there's something wrong with their brain chemistry or their way of thinking, and that if they change their thoughts, they can change their life when they're living under oppressive systems. Unfortunately, my education focused on that quite a bit. So, but it's easier to put it on the person as a society and say something's wrong with that person, instead of governments thinking about how to change structures and fundamentally reorganize all of society. It's easier to put out a post with like a couple tips on how to de-stress without looking at why is this woman stressed? What is her job situation? How does she have this education? How many children does she have? Who is responsible for the care work? Why, you know, all of that is a little too hard. So like, go walking on the beach, take some deep breaths and all that. So yeah, I think it is, for me, intervention on both fronts, the individual front and then the wider social structures, because it's unfair and it is a cop-out, basically, to put all the problems on the person and their faulty cognitions and their faulty brains, instead of looking at the very real circumstances that have them feeling stressed.
Same verbatim, literally the exact same experience. That's why I'm on the board here. You cannot self-care and manifest out of the horrific society we're in. And I want to do what little I can to change that. And Patrice, I'm sure this is your experience too, but I can't tell you how many women come to me and say, I need to work on being more forgiving. I have anger problems, whatever. And then they list any number of things that anybody should be hulking out over. I've had women look me in my face and say, is it okay that I feel this way? You should be more angry, truthfully. Anger is exactly what you should be feeling right now. But the people around them, usually the men around them, will tell them that it is their reaction that's the problem, not the abuse that they're suffering. And I have to be the one to say that is horse manure, and that is the problem. This is what we could do to sort of ease you through this. But yes, be angry.
Thank you for that. And is there anything else anyone? Oh, here we go. Oh, Patrice saying we can't let therapy talk and mental health talk be complicit in silencing women and maintaining oppression. You know, it's been very interesting to see the therapy talk, therapy speak really just blow up on social media. It's everywhere. It is all out of context and all this stuff about how you need to cope and change your mindset. So I think it's really helpful that both of you have talked about the environment and the importance of considering the environment that we're in. And that is what is missing from so many of our conversations and our reactions to gender-based violence and to these horrific news stories. So in the case of Adrielle and Moxie, I think, Jessica, you mentioned this earlier, there are so many systems that have failed, and for some reason, the mother is the focus. Not focus on not having electricity in a particular area because they couldn't be bothered the government couldn't be bothered to put up a pole. No focus on the lack of school buses, public transportation that is safe and specifically for children. Not a whole lot of conversation about community, even though her mother has brought up this question of the village. Where is the village? And it reminds me of the conversation that we had with Soraya Chamali about this book, and so many parts of the book that really challenge the idea that resilience is supposed to be an individual thing and it's all about our strength and just being able to just be mentally strong enough to push through whatever. But actual resilience, real resilience, is about being able to lean on people and being able to have communities that are responsive to our needs. Well, first of all, being able to and comfortable with recognizing and talking about our needs, right? And asking for help, but also having those communities and systems, public goods, public services that meet our needs. And there really are not enough people who are making demands for improvements or complete changes, complete transformation of these systems. And the focus remains on individuals and what individuals should have done better, regardless of their socioeconomic status, all of the barriers that they face in trying to access systems. And we now know that family members tried to involve the Department of Social Services to no real avail. Yeah, much more that I could say on that, but we're down to 5 minutes. So I want to give people one last opportunity to make a comment, ask a question, bring anything else up. And I'm not seeing any hands or anything in the chat. So Dylan, go ahead and be brief because we still do have to have a little wrap up.
Sure, that's fine. Right, earlier, Patrice made a comment about how the argument against like women's rights is always often very lazy and simple, but yet somehow generation to generation, they seem to keep renewing this patriarchal mindset. So what do you think is happening that is making it, I don't know, having men like suddenly galvanized against feminism each generation?
Say that people don't want to lose power. systems of oppression are really resilient, and they shift, they shape shift, they're insidious, and they find ways to maintain power that, even if it's not the same as before, it is an echo. So power is seductive. We live in a capitalist society. It has real tangible benefits on life if you have certain identities. And people do believe within, like deep down in their hearts and souls, that that is their appointed position in society, and they want to maintain that, and they will continue to maintain that, and they will use violence to maintain that, violence or the threat of violence. And I'll give you an example of how I've seen the reaction to the challenge of liberation. So attempts to free oneself or attempts to unpack oppression, however you want to put it. So when you look at articles about gender-based violence in the Caribbean, and you look at the conversation that's being had in court, we talk about victim blaming, we talk about perpetrator excusing. I have spent a lot of time looking at the articles that are written about court exchanges. And what is fascinating to me is how perpetrator excusing has changed with the times. And that is an example of power being resilient and power shifting and taking a different form in order to continue to persist. So before, a lot of the perpetrator excusing took the form of alcoholism. So you'd say, or maybe not a lot, but some took the form of alcoholism. So you'd say, oh, he was drunk when he did this. He beat her because he was drunk. He raped his daughter. He was drunk, etc. That was what resonated in that moment. So that was the one that was deployed. Now that mental health talk has become savvy, that is what you will see. You will see people talking about language that suggests a loss of control. So you would say, oh, he went berserk. He lost, like that, he was not in his correct faculties. So you have the same aim, which is to excuse the perpetrator, but it is co-opting what is common or what is trendy in the society at the given moment. So even though it is the same, when you talk about it being lazy, yeah, because you're doing the same thing. You're somehow shifting the blame from the victim, shifting the blame from the perpetrator and putting it on the victim and not putting the blame where it is. So you have the same concept, but it is clever, it is savvy. It now takes a different form, which people might not have caught to us yet. So they're saying, oh, well, yeah, that does make sense. He must be sick in the mind. Something must be wrong. It's like, no, that is just victim blaming and perpetrator excusing in a different disguise, in a different garb. So you can still prepare for those arguments and you can still push back. But it is fascinating to me how they twist and they shape shift in order to fit whatever is the current context. And because people don't want to give up power, people want an oppressive society. Enslavement was what, 4th century? People are not giving up power.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the pointers on how to push back and such.
Jessica, you wanted to jump in here?
I just wanted to quickly respond to what Patrice was saying. I wanted to quote Dr. Philip Zimbardo, the man who did that infamous Stanford prison experiment. It is an explanation. It's not an excuse. So if a dog bites you because it has rabies, you still stop the dog from biting you, and then you go and deal with it. So it'll never excuse it. It explains it. And I am often enraged by the arguments that people make along those lines, Patrice.
Right. Well, we are at our end time. I don't know about y'all, but it felt like it went pretty quickly. Thank you so much, Erin Greene, in your absence, Patrice Daniel in your presence, and Jessica Russell for being here with us and having this conversation. I think you've all shared so many great insights that all of us will likely be thinking about for a while. I know I'll be coming back to the recording to remind myself of some of what you said and how I can incorporate it into my work as well as my personal life. You know, rage is a difficult emotion to come to terms with when you haven't been practicing it. So really appreciate you sharing your experience on this. A reminder to everyone that we have a lot more events to go. The next one is on Thursday at 6 p.m. at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas. So that will be an in-person event. We'll be joined by life coach Erica Robinson talking about rage as a catalyst. So that will really build on the conversation that we had here today. And then on Saturday, in the daytime, 10 a.m., will be a virtual conversation with Marjan Finlayson about this idea of climate resilience and questioning whether or not we can be climate resilient. And if we can, what does it take? Next week, we have a few more events. And then on the weekend, we have some artsy things going on in person. So be sure to check out the full lineup at tiny.cc/16days24, tiny.cc/16days24, and look out for our demands for the Global 16 Days campaign and beyond. As you probably know, we always have a set of demands and we carry it into the next year. And top of the list, femicide, ensuring that we are naming the gender-based and sex-based killing of women and girls as femicide and being able to actually report on it as such, record it, and do the research and the analysis to ensure that we're able to actually prevent and to intervene in these situations of gender-based violence so that they don't escalate to the point of femicide. Follow us on social media or Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Equality242 and all of those places. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your night.